One of the most moving segments of the book for me, Paul, reading it, was the long-term piece of work you did with the patient called Jay, who was really struggling and suffering with psychosis. You know, as you sort of found yourself in the ward and, you know, got to know the people that were within it, you seemed to notice this sort of recurrent theme of grief. You know, I got a sense of what you were describing was a blockage in mourning, in a way, of the hopes or the loss of hope, rather, perhaps, of and aspirations of a pre-damaged self. Can you say something about that in relationship to the work you did with Jay?
Yes, well, it was something that I became aware of very soon after working in this acute psychiatric unit, where they'd not had a psychotherapist before. And it just seemed to me that people were a lot of quite young patients, really, unable to kind of take up an ordinary life, really, in one way or another, heavily medicated, sometimes drifting around the wards like zombies, really. And what I became aware of, particularly as I started working in the unit, was the grief that accompanies a psychosis. The trauma of the loss of the pre-damaged, the pre-ill self, if you like. And it seemed to me that this was something that was almost ignored, really, in some ways, or taken for granted. And it was difficult because often in the hospital, when I saw patients for the short time they were on the ward, they would begin to open up and seem to be interested in having therapy. But when they were discharged, often very soon, they would come back and say, "Oh no, don't want to talk about anything negative." So you see, the containment of being an inpatient, of the brick and mortar containment of the institution, enabled them to begin to explore their inner life a bit. But there were no daytime facilities, no day hospitals, no residential units to which I could refer patients anymore, as there had been earlier on in the history of psychiatric care when I first started working.
So was that when you were able to do this long-term piece of work with Jay?
That's right. I mean, I was given certain flexibility and I was allowed to do this. And it gave me a much deeper understanding, because I hadn't worked with someone before suffering from psychosis. And in the initial part of the work, it took quite a while to really engage Jay, really. One of the things was that I was, white middle class, he was Asian, and that was something that once I could address that with him, because he clearly was a factor, really, that had to be recognised.
Yes, so you were able to address that, because I think that's one of the areas, if I think about how do we tackle differences, socially constructed, but also materially and experientially real for people in the therapeutic encounter. I noticed that you were able to do that with Jay. Initially, you felt sort of inadequate yourself around talking about the differences in the room and between you both as human beings.
It was something, I must say, that I was alerted to by hearing a speaker from a clinic specialising in working with all sorts of ethnic groups and so on. And she said, you've really got to get hold of it straight away.
Yeah.
I mean, he did have an accent which was a bit hard for me to understand at times. But I came to feel, anyway, in the material I just came to feel that perhaps he felt that I would never understand him, actually. And so I made an interpretation along those lines. I said, given the differences between us and our race and so forth and so on, that I thought he thought I would never understand him, really. Perhaps this was part of the problem too. And when I could talk about that, then he said, oh yes, well, people like me, this is what they would think, we're just dogs, we shouldn't have to work all day and so forth and so on. Let's put it in that kind of term, and it was so dismissive. And then I took up again and I said, well, I think, you probably feel that I think the same way about you, really. And he didn't confirm or deny it, really.
Yeah.
But there was a shift. It was a shift as time went on, really.
Yes, I had a sense reading it, it was a really touching piece of work, and must have touched you also a great deal.
Well, it did. It did. It was hard going. It was hard going. What happened was that we struggled. There was a bit of a struggle to get together, or to kind of reach him, really, for a while. And then he started, then it softened, and he started bringing dreams, really. And this was really a gift, actually, as we say sometimes, a gift from the unconscious, actually. For a while he brought so many dreams out, all told to me at once. I could hardly even remember them, let alone make anything much of them. But then, as time went on, for example, in one session he brought just 4 dreams, and they were short enough for me to hold them in mind, and then there seemed to be a thread going through them. Anyway, when I made an interpretation about that, about what I felt was going on in the dreams, which related to the transference to me, and he then told me about his daily life. It was bleak. This is a man in his 40s, a bright fellow really, watching daytime TV. Well, anything less, anything less encouraging really for anyone. Really, that was what he was stuck with actually. It was heartbreaking. What was coming through in the dreams was a certain sadness, really. Actually, that was what I was picking up and interpreting, and that brought us closer. He then told me.
Yes. So you were really in contact with his grief.
Absolutely. And it was grieving the loss of his pre-damaged self. As a young man, he'd suffered terrible breakdowns, really. And of course he continued to suffer breakdowns, I have to say, for a while throughout the therapy, really. And what was interesting was, although it was an acute psychiatric unit and he would have to be readmitted, now the staff knew I was seeing him, and I never had anybody object. They knew they could see he was getting a bit better.
Yeah.
They didn't mind. They knew that he needed this help, and he could use it. He was using it actually.
Yeah.
So that was very, very touching, really, and supportive of me, because here I was, and they could have complained. You think you're helping this person, here he is coming back again. But what happened? What the difficulty links with the sadness, you see, because his breakdowns tended to occur once we started in therapy, before a break. You see, it was or during a break.
Yeah.
It was again, he got engaged with me, and then the loss was both a reminder of other losses and just plunging him into what Klein described as depressive feelings, which were too premature. The sad feelings were unbearable in some ways, so then he became psychotic, really. And that links with really a psychedelic understanding, really from Klein onwards, that underneath the psychosis, particularly schizophrenia that Klein's colleagues were working with and Klein herself understood, there is a depression.
Because of the nature and depth of the unbearable sadness.
Absolutely. But that was what Klein and followers came to understand. This was underneath in some ways, that needed attending to. But it was starting off with that then helped us engage more with the therapy.
Yeah.
One of the important things, because again, echoing back to the superego, was actually being in touch with a rather different superego, really, here. And what I came to call the psychotic superego. So that was a revelation to me, really. There was another layer, really, of understanding about the superego.
So can you tell me how that functions?
I'll tell you how it revealed itself to me in its worst guise. And this was in the second year of the work, really. I've been working with him. A psychoanalyst was visiting the area in which I was working, and a group of colleagues in that area formed a sort of small ad hoc group for supervision by her. And I was relatively newcomer to the group. Anyway, I was elected to represent, and I chose to talk about my work with Jay, and I had a process recording which I read aloud to the group, including the visiting analyst. Well, once I'd finished the reading, there was a deathly silence.
What was that about?
Well, after the silence, the visiting analyst, turned to me and with barely concealed contempt said, "But you've avoided the transference." Well, I was so humiliated, really, and I could hardly think about what she was saying, really. But thinking it over, it was very hard for me even to admit to myself that before I went in to this session, I thought, well, this is a really good piece of work.
Okay.
What's there going to be to discuss?
Yeah.
Just gives you a glimpse of the omnipotence, actually. But you see, I came to see it as a bit of what's traditionally now called parallel process. When I think I was giving my visiting analyst supervisor a taste of what it was like to be faced with an omnipotent, psychotic superego, really. That was how often my experience with Jay. If I had made any suggestion that he might be going to miss me during a break, or what would be, I'd be met with a withering remark. Why any conversation with you was fruitless, useless, really. It's the kind of way he'd talk about it. Although he was coming, he didn't miss sessions, he was very attending regularly and so on. It was a really omnipotent kind of denial of any need in any little ways, but also quite destructive at times, and of course very destructive for him and his own mind. Robert Caper has written about, at worst, and this is following Beyond, at worst, containment means bearing numbing and deadening what Beyond called beta elements, that numb and deaden the mind. Well, this is exactly, of course, what Jay was suffering from. And at times I would be really unable to think at all, felt very helpless and useless in the sessions. And it was only in supervision, fortunately, regular supervision with my supervisor, that I was astonished that she could think about it.
Yes.
Well,
That's a real external third space.
Somebody can think, It was very demolishing, very demolishing. But it was a revelation of how an alien part of the mind can be so destructive towards it, really, as it could be for Jay.
That relinquishing of omnipotence comes through, doesn't it, towards the end of the work. You find yourself having to almost reshape the way the therapy was going by moving into this sort of virtual email space.
Absolutely. Yes, it was very difficult because we worked together for 4 years, but in the fourth year, unfortunately, due to a change in my own circumstances, I had to announce that I had to leave, really, and give notice. I gave 3 months' notice, but still, it was a short time, really, for Jay. And it was extremely difficult because it didn't fit his needs. It was because of my own personal circumstances, really. So it was far too early for me to finish with him. Fortunately, I could refer him on to another colleague. But nonetheless, because there were various breakdowns, which actually, by the fourth year, he wasn't breaking down anymore.
Oh, okay.
He was getting better. And I had to stop. Not good. However, it meant, of course, in the latter part of that year when I was working with him, that I was trying too hard in all sorts of ways.
Yes.
I felt very guilty about interpreting too quickly and all making mistakes in different ways. Anyway, 6 weeks before we were due to finish, he stopped coming. Somehow he was very resourceful. He discovered my email address in the hospital, and he started sending me emails. Well, for a while, I tried to encourage him to come back, saying I was keeping his appointments for him and so forth and so on and so forth. And he then started becoming, in the emails, rather persecuted, really. It was clear to me he was getting very persecuted by my attempts. And also it became clear to me, thanks to my supervisor, it was a fantasy that you could actually invade somebody else's mind, take it over and influence them in different ways.
You mean and keep him doing the work? And keep him doing the work?
Well, keep him getting to come back to the consulting room and so forth and so on, So I got caught up in that projective process, really. And once I, as I say, with the help of my supervisor, a third party, could disentangle myself a bit in some ways, and for my own projections into him, and actually accept the fact that he probably wouldn't come back, actually, or he might or might not, but there was nothing I could do about it, actually. Just accept my helplessness, really, and the sorrow that perhaps he wouldn't come back. Then things shifted.
Yeah.
And I was able, for example, there was a rather persecutory period, but I was able to just treat it like you would in a session and sort of wait. And I waited, and finally I just wrote and said, look, I'm just thinking about how you are.
Yeah.
And that softened things. And he wrote back and he started writing the emails the way he would talk in the sessions.
Yes.
And we ended with him really being able to say, I said in my penultimate email what a privilege it been to work with him and how sorry I was.
Yes.
He wrote back saying, I miss you too.
Yes, it's a very striking moment in that short form text speak, but how much that would have taken from him to be able to say
it did.
That.
It was so touching. And he sent me a very fine photograph that he had taken of himself. And I thought that in itself was something about a good picture that he still had, that he had now about himself.
And sort of, something about you being able to continue to keep him in mind as you do, really, even now. It's such a beautiful and humane example, I think, of the way that a client can have an impact on the therapist, and how important it is perhaps for the client to see that impact is there and it's real and perhaps ongoing as well.
Indeed. It took me, I was writing a paper every year, and I decided, I thought I must write about the last year, but it took me 7 years to start writing that paper.
Gosh. Yeah.
I did feel very guilty about it. It was a great pity. Great pity. So yes, I had to mourn my omnipotence. It's what, many patients and clients, whatever, and all of us in some ways long for as omnipotent healer. And had to mourn that, and so of course did he. We're mourning together. Really.
There's something about, I think you write about this actually in the chapter about sort of reworking the healer-healed dialectic, so something more complex comes into being.
Well, if we get drawn into this healer, omnipotent kind of healer transference in some ways, it could be denying our sadism, our destructiveness in that kind of way. And that's not good. It's not helpful for the work, really. That's something we've got to be in touch with all the time.
Yeah.